Welcome to Brain Navat. We are delighted to welcome back one of our most prolific guests and occasional co-host, Travis Timmerman, and we're going to be talking about virtue ethics. Travis, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
Yeah, so I want to start with a widely known thought experiment where the view about what you should do, morally speaking, is um, quite clear. So it's an analog of Singer's famous drowning child case, but I'll suppose also that you can save this child at almost no cost to yourself. Right? So suppose you see a child drowning in a shallow pond. Um, they're there through no fault of their own. They don't deserve to be there. You could rescue them. If you do, they're not going to hurt anyone else. There's not going to be some unforeseen downstream negative consequences. And it's no danger to you to wade in and save the child. And the way that it's normally told, there's some sort of sacrifice that you have to make. But let's suppose now that the sacrifice is extraordinarily minor. Maybe you're slightly uncomfortable getting in some cold water up to your ankles. Okay. And now we can ask, what should you do in that case? And supposing that it's a one-off case, I think there's agreement among normative ethicists that what you should do is wade into the pond and save the child. Furthermore, that you'd be doing something wrong if you fail to do that. So supposing that that's the correct view, we can ask a further question. Why is it the case that you morally ought to go in and save the child? And different normative ethical views will give different answers to that question. Right? So, like, one project of normative ethics is to figure out not only what actions are right or wrong, supererogatory, maybe outside the bounds of morality, so on, but what makes it the case that they have those statuses. So, if you were to take an introduction to ethics class at a typical university, the ethics professor might say something like, well, there's consequentialism, and consequentialism says you should go save the child because it produces the best consequences. Where that's often cashed out in terms of maximizing well-being for everybody that matters. Or they'll say, you could be a deontologist, where they really mean like a Kantian, and they'll say you should save the child because you have a duty to save in easy rescue cases for a variety of reasons. Maybe failing to save the child would be treating them as a mere means, or there's no way to fail to save the child in these sorts of cases that wouldn't violate a universalizable maxim. Now, we're not talking about Kantianism now. Then they'll say, oh, there's a third alternative, virtue ethics. And they might try to cash out the explanation in this way. You should save the child because that's what a virtuous person would do if they were in those circumstances. Now, there's various more complicated formulations, but that's the gist of it. And I want to focus on that sort of explanation. I wonder, is it actually inconsistent with the other views that are being described? And could they give a plausible explanation of why that's the case? In some sense, it might be true. That a virtuous agent would do this in those circumstances, and that could give you justification for believing that that's what you ought to do. But I find it highly implausible that that's what makes it the case that you ought to save the child. And to try to push that point, I want to offer a dilemma that's in a paper that Ishai Cohen and I wrote. So here's the question that I want to ask for the dilemma. Why would the virtuous agent save the child in those circumstances? At the most basic level, I think either because the virtuous agent recognizes that there's good moral reason to do so, and whatever that moral reason is what determines our obligation to save the child in that case. Or they don't, and it's just something that has to do with the fact that that's what the virtuous agent would do. But if they don't have some independent moral reason that's determining why they should, then it's unclear why we should care what a virtuous agent would do in those circumstances. So the thought is, virtue ethics is subject to a dilemma. Either it's going to render any talk of a virtuous agent completely superfluous, not be a distinctively virtue ethical view, or it's not going to be able to plausibly explain why we're obligated to do the things that we're obligated to do.
So one way that virtue ethicists defend against these kind of objections is by saying that when we talk about the virtuous person, we're using that as a shorthand for the person who acts in accordance with the following set of virtues, and those virtues can be listed. So courage, empathy, kindness, etc., etc. Those three, I think, would be at play when deciding to rescue the child. So it seems like someone who's empathetic is someone who would think about themselves in that person's shoes when they're drowning. Oh, wow, if I was drowning in a pond, I'd want a stranger to come and rescue me. Let me go and rescue that child. A kind person would be someone who cares about the suffering of others, the child's suffering, stop their suffering. And the courageous person is someone who their own well-being, that's not the foremost issue in their minds, and they're able to put themselves in danger to pursue some good. So in this case, there's no danger, but whatever kind of inconvenience there is, their courage would help them surpass that. So it seems like the virtue ethicist, at least in this case, can point to those three virtues independently of pointing to utility or a deontological explanation for why the virtuous person should rescue the child.
I think that's right. So one way to understand at least some versions of virtue ethics is to say, well, we don't need to connect what a virtuous agent would do to right action in this way. That's really just sort of a proxy for talking about virtues, or what sometimes people call the reasons, or there's different terms for it. And it's those that determine what we're obligated to do in various cases. Right? And that would render an explanation that's inconsistent or different from standard versions of consequentialism, from Kantianism, from standard versions of contractualism, and so on. Right? So the first response that I want to give is to just say, yes, that's exactly right. And I think it's helpful to think through these cases to sort of figure out the ways in which views differ from one another, and at the most fundamental level. The other thing that I want to say is that those explanations that employ at least some virtue theoretic concepts are still not inconsistent with the range of possible consequentialist views, the range of possible deontological views, the range of possible contractualist views. And recognizing that can be helpful, again, for just sort of understanding the structure of different normative ethical theories and where they may, at the fundamental level, disagree with one another. So you could have a deontological view that generates deontic prohibitions that says it's wrong to do something that's failing to act on these virtues in these circumstances, regardless of any other considerations. And I think that would be accurately described as a deontological view. You could have a consequentialist view that says you determine the goodness or badness of consequences not by welfare, or at least not solely by that, but also by looking at whether the agent is acting on these dispositions that we're calling virtues, or whether you're employing these virtue theoretic concepts in the right sort of way. And that itself determines how good or bad the consequences are. So the consequences might be better if these virtues are acted on, even if there's less welfare overall. Now, that's not how typical consequentialists talk, but nevertheless, we can see that the nature of the disagreement between these normative ethical views isn't, for instance, about whether the consequences matter or whether virtues matter. It's a fundamental disagreement about what determines those verdicts. The other thing to say about this view is that it's saying that the virtues are prior to what are called the deontic verdicts, where deontic verdicts is just a technical term that refers to basically, I'll just say, the moral status of acts or beliefs or dispositions, whatever you think can have these sorts of moral valuations of being permissible or impermissible, and so on. I think that is going to require an explanation that I'm not sure can be worked out plausibly. So if it's divorced from the deontic verdicts in this way, I want to know, like, well, why is kindness good, for instance? If kindness didn't result in benefiting morally considerable beings in the right sort of way, is that something that we would think determines right or wrong, or would give us moral reasons to act? So the first thing I'm going to say is just grant that that's a way to cash out the view that's more plausible than the initial version that I described. Say it's valuable to think about for various reasons. But then the second thing I want to say is I need to hear a lot more about how this is going to be filled out, where these virtue theoretic concepts are the determinants of right or wrong, in a way that's plausible. And I'm at least skeptical that that can be done.
Yeah, so one concern you might have is that if you take a virtue like bravery and you couple it with other traits, it could yield very bad consequences. So if you're thinking about whether you want the Nazi to be brave or cowardly, you'd prefer on a consequentialist level for them to be a cowardly Nazi, because the brave Nazi takes all these risks so that he can kill more Allied soldiers or round up more Jews and cause more suffering in the world. But he undoubtedly acts in a brave way by taking risks, putting himself in harm's way to kind of achieve an objective for this movement. You might think that the brave Nazi is also incredibly loyal, that he's loyal to his Nazi comrades, to the ideology. You might think he lacks certain virtues like universal empathy, or that he's acted in some way that's unwise. But there's a sense in which the virtues on their own, once they're disconnected from consequences, we start to think maybe they're less good. But there is a sense in which, in our everyday language about people, we do like virtue language. So, when people are evaluating, the morality of their friends, they'll often think, so-and-so is very wise, that, I can go to them and I can get good counsel from them. They don't say, so-and-so is a really good utility maximizer, and I can be ensured that, they will do the calculation correctly and ensure that the most optimal result happens. Like, we might think that if people use utilitarian language to describe their moral reasoning, it often can sound callous. So, you might think, for example, if you're deciding about an end-of-life choice for a loved one, an animal or a friend, that if you said, well, I've run the numbers and the right decision is to end their lives, or to keep them on life support, we think that was sort of a strange way of looking at it versus saying, I'm acting with some kind of mercy, some kind of loyalty to them, whatever it is. There's something about the softness of virtue that we find quite palatable. So I wonder, does it have a place? Could it be either a strong actual rivaling moral theory, or is it a lens that we use to sort of push through other important moral traits, like, one way to respect rights is to, be wise. That a kind person is sort of aware of the consequences of treat people in an unkind way, that it just becomes a sort of tool for other genuine moral theories.
Yeah, great question. I think the answer is both. So let me just respond to the first part of what you said before about the brave Nazi. I haven't heard a Jewish person say such nice things about Nazis ever. But so I think the virtue ethicist would say, well, in those cases, there's always going to be some vices that they're acting on too. And we don't have to talk about consequences. But that just pushes the challenge back one step, which is to say, well, now ask why these are virtues and these are vices, and do so in a way that doesn't connect to the effects on the well-being of morally considerable creatures. I think that's going to be hard to do. Now, to your main question, I think virtue ethics is a big umbrella that covers a bunch of different views that are trying to do different things. And some of them are very plausible, and some of them are not so plausible. Some of them are inconsistent with other normative ethical views, and some are not. Right. So I think you can have a virtue ethical view whose aim is to tell typical agents, fallible human agents, about giving them practical advice about how to deliberate morally in ways that are going to put them broadly on the right track to be a good person rather than the wrong track, and help them engage in various moral exercises that'll develop the character in the right way to have the sort of know-how to behave ethically rather than unethically. And I think that's extraordinarily valuable. And if that's the project, it doesn't say anything about what makes acts right or wrong at this metaphysical level. And those views, even though such virtue ethicists will hate me saying this, they're not inconsistent with, say, standard versions of utilitarianism or Kantianism, because they're just about different things. If you ask proponents of those views, like, well, what do they think makes acts right or wrong at a metaphysical level, they're surely not going to assent to utilitarianism. But if you're looking at what they put on the page, and if that's the project, that's actually consistent, logically consistent with a variety of different normative ethical views, which I think is really interesting to recognize. As far as the metaphysical project, if you're going to be a competitor with, say, standard versions of utilitarianism, you're going to have to take a stance on what the right and wrong making features are. And then I think there's not a way for virtue ethical accounts to be competitors to those views that are to both be a competitor, as to say, give an inconsistent explanation about what makes acts have the deontic statuses that they do, and to be plausible. So I just think once we sort of see what it would take to be a true competitor, then we're going to see that that's an implausible explanation. So they're really best thought of as different projects.
I want to return to something you've mentioned a few times, which is you say the virtue ethicist needs to explain why kindness is good, why sadism is bad, why the virtues are good and why the vices are bad. And I'm guessing what you're trying to say is there's an incomplete theory here. We don't really understand why. And that to answer those questions, they're likely going to refer to either a consequentialist or a deontological explanation. And so you've collapsed the theory. But the virtue ethicist could say, well, you're asking one question too many. So why do I have to answer as a virtue? By the way, I'm not a virtue ethicist. I've just been put in the position now all of a sudden of defending virtue ethics. But anyway, why, as the virtue ethicist, do I need to argue for the goodness, all things being equal, of kindness or bravery? I think what's interesting about Marx's objection to bravery is that it's not all things being equal. So he hasn't given a case where all things being equal, being brave is not better than not being brave. There's some very not equal situation going on, which is that the person we're referring to is a Nazi. But all things being equal, the virtue ethicist is going to say bravery is a good thing. And that just seems plausible, right? It's kind of like asking, well, why is utility a good thing? Why is it a good thing to treat someone with dignity or respect? Why is it a good thing not to use someone as a means to an end? The utilitarian in the first case, or the Kantian in the latter cases, could say, you've asked one question too many. It's just intuitively true that it's not a good idea to treat people as a means to an end. It's intuitively true that utility is a good thing. We don't need to argue for that. That's just plausible. And the virtue ethicist could say, well, it's just plausible that kindness is a good thing, all things being equal.
Excellent. So I think there's two things to say there. One goes back to Mark's question. So, I mean, one thing to say is that seems intuitively plausible because there's such a clear connection that serves as a background sort of consideration in our minds when we're thinking about this, between being kind and benefiting people who deserve it. And you can say the converse about vices and their negative consequences. And it seems like I could imagine situations in which these things come apart. That is, in which doing something that is considered a virtue results in consequences that would be regarded universally as disastrous. Well, there's a question about whether you can do the same thing with respect to enhancing welfare. And there I'm just going to maybe bite some bullets that virtue ethicists don't want, and they'll bite bullets that I don't think are plausible to bite. And that might identify sort of fundamental disagreement between us. And that'd be valuable to do. The other thing that they could say is, well, the way to understand the virtue of, say, courage is going to be so much more fine-grained. There's going to be dispositions in these highly context-sensitive situations that it's just not courageous to, risk your life in ways that are bringing about some morally bad outcome. Maybe there's some other word that we use for it, but the normatively thick term courage is used in such a way as to rule out those possibilities. And I think that's plausible, and, fine, people are entitled to use terms how they want. And it's just a matter of sort of getting clear on what those terms are. The second thing to say, and this goes back to Mark's question, is that there seems to be something sort of callous about if a utilitarian saying that they're acting on utilitarian reasoning as an explanation for their actions that maybe isn't present with respect to virtue ethics. And I'm actually sort of skeptical about that. So, no, it could be the case if my like wife Amanda's in the hospital and I come and visit her, and she's like, "Oh, that's so nice of you to visit me. Why did you do that?" I said, "Well, I ran the calculations with my buddy Jason, who's utilitarian, and it just worked out that it maximized utility." So there seems to be something bad about that. That's the one thought too many objection that some people have, like Bernard Williams. But I think there's a similar problem with virtue ethics. So if I visit her in the hospital and she says, "Why, it's so nice that you're doing this," and I said, "Well, I asked myself what a virtuous agent would do in this situation," and they would go visit their wife. So like I was like, all right, and then I went and did it. I mean, that seems callous too. So I think just in general, explaining the like fundamental right and wrong making features of actions as your motivating reason for why you act sounds bad on any sort of existing normative ethical view. And I don't think that really counts against it, like making actions right or wrong, but it does maybe tell you something about what kinds of moral deliberation that you should engage in when you're deciding how to act. Maybe there is something like callous about just doing it at the fundamental level for all of your actions. That said, I personally wouldn't be offended if people do things because they maximize utility. They could be, glad too. Like, I went to visit my wife because it maximized utility, but I'm also happy that maximized utility. I was excited that that's what did it rather than visiting some stranger that would have bummed me out. But I would have done that because that's the right thing to do. So I really think you should just sort of care about and be moved by and act on what the right thing to do is at any time.
One of the things that's kind of complicated about trying to lead a moral life is when you have a variety of different values that seem to clash. And so the advantage of a moral theory that can tell you with absolute certainty this is what you should do and this is what you should not do is useful, and that it's highly action guiding. So, if you're a rights theorist, you sort of ask yourself, well, am I infringing upon anybody's rights by doing this? Am I, breaking any, universal maxims? If you're a utilitarian, you say, well, does this maximize the good? If you're a virtue ethicist, it's complicated because the one is, what would the virtuous person do? And so there's many virtuous people, and it's not obvious that all of them would do the same thing. Or if we boil it down to underlying virtues, it might be that they're in tension with each other. So, my wife says to me, do I look good in these jeans? I can either be kind and say, yes, darling, of course, or I can be honest and say, no, you look really fat. Now, it's unclear what I ought to do in those circumstances. And my guess is that there are going to be a lot of virtues that could lead us astray or pull us apart. And maybe the claim is the wise person knows which set of virtues to kind of, rely on. But then it seems for some end, like the one that causes the least suffering or the one that, doesn't intrude on rights. Then we're sort of out of the full moral language of virtue ethics. One of the debates that Jason and I have quite often is he's a hard-nosed utilitarian, but thinks that there are non-moral things in life. So he would call them perfections, like aesthetic values, like a sense of community, love, taste. And so it might very well be the example that often comes up for us is around eating meat. Jason will take the view it's wrong to eat meat, but that doesn't mean you should refrain from doing it. There are other factors, like you're sitting around your family dinner and it's Thanksgiving and there's the turkey. Like refusing to eat the turkey, one, you're missing out on all the delicious pleasures of the turkey. Two, you're defying a long tradition, and there's something about keeping tradition that's important. And then you're upsetting everyone around the table because you're not partaking. So what's interesting is that virtue ethics seems to give you a little bit of wiggle room on these things, because you've got these gray areas around what you can do in a way that other moral theories don't. Or the claim is that you can have a firm moral theory, but you can take into account these other factors. And then there's a meta question about how you do that balancing act. So I wonder if you think that that balancing act can be done, or whether you always have a morality trump card, and that the other factors must fall by the wayside when you're in the immoral territory.
Let me say first off, like, it is wrong to eat meat, and that's an overriding consideration. So you should just not do it. in typical circumstances. Obviously, if somebody is going to blow up the world or something, unless you take a bite of turkey, then it'd be wrong not to eat meat. But I'd highly recommend Peter Singer's little book. I think it's called "Consider the Turkey," that just came out this last Thanksgiving. But okay, let's just talk about the substance of your question. With respect to cases where different virtuous agents would do different things, there I think the virtuous agent can say, well, then anything that a virtuous agent would do in the circumstances would be permissible. And if there's different things that they would do, then they'd be permissible but not required. If it's a case where all virtuous agents would do the same thing, like I think save the drowning child in the easy rescue case that I gave, then it would be required. And if there's something that no virtuous agents would do in the situation, then it would be prohibited. But that doesn't really solve the more serious issue that you're pointing to, because it just pushes the question back, or raises the question, why would virtuous agents do those things in those circumstances? And there I think you're going to have to look at what the virtues are on the account in question and how you weigh them against one another when they conflict in these situations. And that's, I think, a problem for virtue ethical views. This goes back to a point that Jason was raising earlier, which is that virtue ethics is far from a complete normative ethical theory, in the sense of no existing account of virtue ethics is worked out in enough detail to tell you what virtuous agents would do in all of these possible situations. So by contrast, if I am wondering what I should do according to utilitarianism, and I know all of the relevant non-moral facts, then I can get a ranking of what the best and worst outcomes are according to the utilitarian view. And then if it's maximizing, I know what I'm obligated to do. But accounts of virtue ethics are just not worked out in close to enough detail to do that. So I might know, well, in the paper that Isha and I wrote, we consider a complicated case where a woman is trying to decide whether to have a late-term abortion. And we list various virtues that would be displayed on each of the options available to her, and then try to figure out how to weigh them against one another. And there's just no virtue ethical view that's worked out in enough detail to give an answer to that question, even if you know all of the non-moral facts, like how it's going to affect others and so on. Now, if you don't like that case, you could pick any sort of complicated moral case where it looks like the virtues will compete with one another, and then ask what you should do. And virtue ethical views, as they've been described in print, are just going to be too imprecise to render a verdict in that case. Okay, so what to say about that? Well, one thing some virtue ethicists will say is they'll appeal to what's called the unity of the virtues. They'll say we have this rich sort of moral language that appeals to lots of things like virtue, but they really can all be subsumed under one single virtue, or a smaller set of virtues, perhaps. But I don't think that helps, because you still, in order to figure out what to do in the relevant sorts of situations, are going to have to figure out, like, well, in what ways are they subsumed? And then how does it work out such that one of the actions available to you displays the virtue in the way that determines what the virtuous agent would do, or where it weighs against one another in such a way that multiple acts are permissible. And they just don't do that. Another thing that they might say is, well, you can't do that. The utilitarian thinks you can. The Kantian thinks you can, but they're mistaken. Morality's complicated. Life is messy. There's all of these competing considerations, and it's so complicated and so context sensitive that we really should think what's called moral particularism is true. Just to say, like, morality's so complicated that there's just not finitely statable principles that could guide our action in every possible case. Okay. So my response to that is to say, yeah, that may be correct. But virtue ethics, as it's been put in print, isn't worked out in enough detail to handle lots of easy to navigate situations either. In cases where it's very clear what you should do, they're just not worked out in print in enough detail such that if there's two competing virtues, they can render a determinate deontic verdict. And I think that's a shortcoming of those views. The other thing to say is I just think there's good arguments against moral particularism, but I for other reasons that are sort of outside the bounds of the criticism here, I'm skeptical that that's a feasible way to go. But the last thing is, you asked if this is like a feature sort of the view rather than a bug, because it gives you a sort of some moral leeway in these cases. And I think, no, this is actually a bug, both theoretically, trying to give a plausible moral theory, and if it's going to help us guide action. Because any time that you propose a sort of pluralistic account of goods and don't specify how they weigh against one another, then when people are deliberating morally and they're prone to things like confirmation bias, and they're prone to things like doing what's in their self-interest, right? It makes it easier for them to just not think critically about the difficult to navigate moral situations and do what they want to do anyway, and then justify it by saying, oh, well, there's different goods and they weigh against one another in a sort of complicated way, and there's not a precise way to work that out. So I actually think that kind of account of how we should live our lives is going to, and in fact results in people justifying immoral behavior, or being more likely to just sort of act blindly in light of what they want to do, rather than really try to act in accordance with what morality demands of us. Now, it could be the case that given our cognitive limitations, we can't do better. But nevertheless, I do think that is a bad making feature. It'd be unfortunate if that's the best that we can do.
So a few things. Firstly, eating meat is not that bad. It's bad, but it's not that bad. And because it's not that bad, you have these non-moral reasons trumping the moral reason in a lot of cases. So sure, yes, in the case where someone's going to blow up the world, unless you eat the turkey, I agree, you should eat the turkey. That's the moral thing to do. But I think in a lot of other cases too, I think if you're just traveling and there's some turkey, you can eat the turkey. If you're coming home from work and you're hungry, you can eat the turkey. Not morally. I think it's immoral. I agree with you. It's immoral. It's just we're going to have a different view on how immoral it is. And I'm saying that there are these competing values that could push it over into okay. Not morally okay, but okay considering all these values. I take your criticism to heart that it is a problem to have a view where you haven't worked out which goods trump which goods and how to weight them. I think that is a very big problem. I don't think it's an intractable problem. I don't think it's a problem that can't be solved, but I agree that absent solving that problem, you have an issue, and that it does allow us to justify in a lazy way behavior that we want to perform without having good reasons for doing so. But I think you have to separate out the problem of sort of trying to make people more moral by having a moral theory that will push them to do so, versus describing the world accurately. And those are two different considerations. So it could very well be that the correct moral theory, in the sense of describing the world accurately, doesn't provide the kind of motivation that people need to behave morally. That seems entirely possible. So I don't think the question of which moral theory is true is the same question as which moral theory would produce the best behavior, in the sense that it's the most convincing moral theory. So I don't think something has to be convincing for it to be true.
Yes, this raises an interesting question about whether morality trumps other considerations. And there's a literature on what's called moral rationalism, where the standard way to cash it out is to say that if you're morally obligated to perform some act, then you're rationally obligated to perform it as well. That is, it's all things considered. And I'm convinced by arguments in that literature that moral rationalism is true. But I also grant that there's non-moral considerations that weigh against moral considerations. I just think that constrains what our moral obligations are. And that's the level at which the constraint comes in. But then if the moral reasons are going to outweigh the non-moral reasons in a way that generates a moral obligation, then I think it's overriding. Now, it's confusing because philosophers, some of them also talk about whether just moral reasons trump non-moral reasons. And there's an extreme view that any time a moral reason has to be weighed against a non-moral reason, the moral reason wins out. And I think that view is wildly implausible. There's no way that could be true. At least if we have a sort of standard understanding of what moral and non-moral reasons are. The other thing, I know this was not the main point of what you're saying, but I just am curious. Do you think it's also okay to like eat babies, like at a culture where like you're factory farming, babies or human persons? And if that's really wrong, what's the difference between that and the actual world?
Well, let's separate out the question, would factory farming human babies be very wrong, from the question of, given that we are factory farming human babies, would it be very wrong to eat them? I think factory farming human babies would be a lot worse than factory farming animals. So I want that acknowledged. And given that, I think the small, very small part you play in supporting that industry is more wrong than the very small part you play in supporting the animal farming industry. So it is more wrong. Is it abominably wrong to eat the child in a world where children are mass produced as meat by a farming operation? I think it might just spill over into something that you can't do, but I don't think it's nearly as bad as you would think it is. Given that the wrongness is really being placed on the farming operation rather than on the eating. So I'm not saying there's nothing wrong with the scenario. I'm just locating the wrongness elsewhere. Also, by the way, this problem that Mark and you are pointing out with virtue ethics does seem to be a problem for a lot of deontological theories as well. This problem of conflicting prohibitions or conflicting obligations. So rights theorists are going to have a number of rights that they say have to be maintained in any given scenario, and sometimes you have to choose which right to violate. It's going to be very hard to do so. It seems like without some meta principle, which is non-deontic, you're going to have to just flip a coin. So at least the virtue ethicist can say, with regards to this objection, that he can argue to a draw. I agree with you that utilitarianism is not going to have this problem, although it could have something analogous. So perhaps there's two actions which result in equal utility, but the one set of utility is very different from another. So action one produces an enormous amount of suffering and an enormous amount of pleasure, and it balances out to zero. Action two produces no significant suffering or pleasure for anyone involved. It seems like they're very different actions. Which one should you perform? The utilitarian says, don't know. The net result is the same. The utility is the same. Don't know. We would need some additional view on whether suffering should be weighted more than pleasure in order to decide those cases, or whether there's thresholds on how much suffering we can inflict, etc. So, the virtue ethicist can say, well, I can argue to a draw here.
So your comments, I think, raise two important things to discuss. So one is, I totally take the point about there being a distinction between what moral theory might be true and like what sorts of moral theory, if you get people to internalize, are going to result in like the people that act closest in line with morality or produce the best society and so on. And I wonder, and I think it may be very plausible that there's a case to be made that at least some version of virtue ethics, trying to get people to adopt or internalize that, is going to be a way to get people, by and large, to act morally better than they would otherwise. Now, about the arguing to a draw point. So for even utilitarianism that thinks of pleasure and pain as distinct goods, and you have to give some account of how to weigh them against one another, and you're not treating them equally, that problem arises. I think it'll arise for a utilitarian view that adopts an account of well-being that posits pluralistic goods. Anytime you're positing, qualitatively distinct goods and bads, and then you're saying that they factor into our moral deliberation in such a way that they can affect our moral reasons, but you don't specify how, you run into that problem. But I don't think it's a draw, because I think various versions of moral particularism and virtue ethics have so many more levels at which there's supposed to be different qualitatively distinct goods and bads that are weighing against one another that is not explained. Now, maybe theoretically, we shouldn't think that the view is less likely to be the true view, because there's more levels at which there's this there are these mix of goods and bads that have to be worked out in a way. I think that's right. Actually, I don't think that it's a draw in terms of like plausibility for being true. But I do think it counts more against virtue ethics as a view about offering practical guidance for how to live our lives. If there's in fact more levels of this ambiguity that's just not specified, that's just more opportunities for people to say, oh, well, there's just different goods here and this seems plausible to me, so I'm going to do that. So I think it does count against it as a view about practically living our lives in such a way that we be moral agents, in spite of me just saying that it might be the best view to teach people to get them to live moral lives. I do think that's a cost.
So what about seeing virtue ethics as a supplementary moral theory? So you can imagine a rights view that discounts any positive rights. So no one has a right to receive something. You just have obligations not to go and infringe on people's rights. So it's a thou shalt not moral theory. But then that doesn't tell you things like go and look after the child or go and give charity, go and be brave. So that's where the virtue ethic steps in. It becomes a thou shalt do the following things, provided, of course, that you first don't, knock anyone's rights. A consequentialist, of course, is not going to have a view like that. It might very well be that infringing on some rights is going to yield some, really good positive utility. But here you have two theories that could work quite well together. The one that says, don't do the following things. The other one says, provided you've met that first hurdle, here are all the ways in which you can be good in the world. And then it also might be quite good on the moral education front. So if you think about how people are sort of taught about morality from a young age, often it's a series of rules like don't do these things. And then there's trying to inculcate certain character traits. So, parents will model a way of being, like they will show their kids this is what it is to be kind by being kind. So it could be that's why these things are, this blended view is an attractive one, is that probably makes up a large part of our actual moral education in a way that, run the numbers doesn't. Most people are not very mathematically inclined, poor utility calculators. I think utilitarians probably take the view that you shouldn't tell people to be utilitarians because they're going to be really bad at it. And if you want to maximize the good, you should probably give them some other sort of moral education, and that'll actually maximize the good. So, yeah, there's an interesting way in which you can try and take into account these different moral theories and still be utilitarian.
Yeah, I think that's largely right. Not only are people maybe not good utility maximized, but it's also just because there's so much uncertainty about the effects of our actions that it'd be very hard to maximize expected utility that's not relying on something like these, mid-level principles about being kind and virtuous to others, except in maybe certain complicated extenuating circumstances. But the typical day-to-day interactions that people have, you wouldn't be able to get more fine-grained than that. I do think, and this is just as an aside, you could have utilitarian views that respect rights that are fine-grained enough. They're not rights as typical rights theorists think about them, but like they could respect the view that you have a right to always have your interests given equal consideration, right? Even if the weights don't work out in your favor and then you end up being justifiably harmed, that you had the right to have your welfare given equal consideration in the moral calculus, or you have a right to be benefited when doing so maximizes utility. And it would just then be logically impossible for a utilitarian view to generate the verdict that it'd be obligatory to violate the right. Now, I mean, that's not a substantively different way of explaining the utilitarian view than typical utilitarians do. But I do think it helps us sort of pinpoint the locus of disagreement between these views. I do think it's a sort of interesting and fruitful project to try to think through how you could pair different normative ethical views together for the ideal moral education. And I'd like to see more philosophers do that. Virtue ethicists have, in fact, sort of, by and large, taken up that project in the ethics literature, but there's no reason that it should be exclusive to them. And I think there's a lot of fruitful theorizing to do to try to expand that in precisely the way that you were doing just now. There's lots of interesting views that could be cashed out, and then we can sort of think through the reasons to accept them versus others. And that seems like a good version of moral inquiry that I'd like to see more and more people do who are not virtue ethicists.
It could be that I'm really trying hard here to defend virtue ethics. It could be that we've just misunderstood what virtue ethics is. So understanding it as a theory of right action is not helpful. It might better be understood as a theory of good character. So in other words, what makes someone's character good or bad? Well, the virtues or the vices. The problem lies in assuming a necessary link between virtues and right action or vices and wrong action. It's entirely conceivable, it seems, although this would be a counterexample to virtue ethics as it's usually framed, that someone who has bad reasons for doing something could do the right thing, and someone who has good reasons for doing something does the wrong thing. That seems quite intuitive and plausible, but is ruled out by the virtue ethics account of right action. But if we understand it purely as a theory of good character, that seems very plausible. It seems to provide quite a good understanding of what makes a person a good person. Or do you think even that understanding of virtue ethics is not plausible?
On the contrary, I think that is plausible, and I think that is something that lots of virtue ethicists have tried to do. And I think it's important to distinguish between different virtue ethical views and what their goals are and how successful they are at achieving those goals. And I think that's valuable so we not only inadvertently talk past one another, which is what happens when we just sort of say, oh, these are all normative ethical views and they're all competing with one another. And then you can pick one, and then people sort of pick some to use as a framework, to do their moral deliberation. When in fact, you could be in one sense a virtue ethicist and another sense a utilitarian, and that's perfectly consistent. So I think that's actually really important to do and to recognize. Does that make somebody a good person? Well, I think what it means to be a good person itself is subject to some ambiguity. Does it mean that they do the right action? Does it mean that they're disposed to? Does it mean they're praiseworthy? Does it mean all of the above? But I think so. But I do think that would go a long way towards somebody who acts on very plausible virtues in a variety of everyday circumstances. Would go a very long way towards being a good person in a sort of colloquial sense of the term. The rubber might hit the road, so to speak, when it comes to cases where there's a conflict between acting on these virtues understood at the general level and then doing things that are going to cause a bunch of harm, or just more broadly in any sort of moral dilemma type situation. But it's not an all or nothing thing. People can be more and less good, and they will be more and less good over the course of their life. And it's just a sort of matter of degrees between the optimal best that you could be and the worst that you could possibly be.
So there's another way about thinking about virtue ethics that's not about what you are as a person or what you ought to do. It's about thinking about virtue on a more political level. So the idea that as a community, we ought to have the following virtues, or that our laws ought to lead to virtuous outcomes. So, a kind of social conservative position on, let's say, what kinds of content we ought to allow on television might take something like that into account. So you might say we ought not to have hyper violent content on television because it shows a level of viciousness. You've got characters who show a disdain for life, that are celebrated, and this is a bad thing. That if you allow people to exercise their freedoms, even in ways that don't cause any harm or don't infringe on any rights, they nonetheless display a kind of poor character trait. That sort of alliance between social conservatism and virtue, I think, makes some people feel quite uncomfortable. But it is a rallying cry for groups that have wanted to say the reason why we need to do this is for the sake of the children, or to protect our fundamental values.
Yeah, it certainly makes me uncomfortable because I'm not a social conservative. I think a lot of that's going to depend on what the correct virtues are, and then what the empirical case is to be made that allowing, for instance, certain types of things on television or violent video games or whatever is going to make people vicious rather than virtuous. So like one concern that sort of carries over from the theoretical concerns about virtue ethics is that these terms are ambiguous to such a high degree that it's like really hard to assess the case for whether somebody's displaying a virtue or not. I mean, there might be sort of clear determinate cases where they are and clear determinate cases where there's not. And then there's going to be a lot where it's like, well, it's sort of unclear what the extension of that concept is. And people might be talking past one another just as a result of the ambiguity surrounding the nature of these virtue theoretic concepts. The other thing to say is I am not an expert on the empirical literature, but some of what I had read about it with respect to violent video games when I was in college, so that was a long time ago now, and to television shows, I just don't think, given my limited exposure to the evidence, that there's a compelling case to be made that violent TV, for instance, is going to have any noticeable causal effect on the degree to which society is virtuous or vicious. And I'm old enough to remember, like when I was a kid, The Simpsons was very controversial. The Simpsons, right? Now it's on Disney Plus, and lots of people are happy to have their kids watch this thing that's like TV PG. But Bart speaking back to adults was considered like vicious. And then when that became so widely popular at the expense of the Cosby Show, of all shows, like I got that show canceled. I don't think there was any. I don't think there's any evidence that people got more vicious when The Simpsons became popular at the Cosby Show. And then you just see that level get, things become more and more and more graphic over the years. And now you can watch essentially R-rated or NC-17 shows on stuff like HBO Max. You can stream it very easily, widely available. And again, I don't think there's any compelling empirical evidence that's going to plausibly establish a causal connection between the prevalence of these shows and then society becoming more virtuous and vicious. And the last thing I'll say about that is lots of people who self-describe as social conservatives that are complain about that. I'm just going to deny that the things that they think are vices are in fact vices.
Okay, I'm going to give you a case for why we might think that virtue matters. So one of the earlier things we discussed was this idea around eating meat and why it's wrong. But one of the arguments we've discussed on the show a couple of times is whether there is any causal efficacy in an individual's decision not to eat meat. And it sounds like the best way of understanding it is that you are rolling a dice, that it's possible you might be the person who makes the difference, that your decision not to eat meat leads to the supermarket ordering 1,000 less steaks, and you get the grand prize of saving a cow. But it's also entirely possible that when you roll that sort of that dice, that nothing happens. You just miss out on eating meat. But we might think that one reason to not eat the meat is that it shows something vicious in your character to be the kind of person who eats meat. In the same way that if you're the kind of person who eats the babies in a society where we've got baby factory farms and your decision to partake in the eating of babies will have no effect whatsoever, no baby lives are going to be saved because of your refusal, because of the scale at which the operation is done. But we think that there's a good virtue reason to not do it. And that it gives a better account of being a vegetarian than the other views would. The consequentialists might struggle to explain why it's this very strong moral imperative not to eat meat when they're basically saying, hey, you're buying a lottery ticket and maybe your action will lead to some utility gain, but most of the time it's going to lead to no consequential change. Whereas the virtue ethicist every time can tell you this is a really vicious thing. You're participating in a sinister practice where there's enormous amounts of suffering that happen, and the participation itself detracts from your character, and that's why you shouldn't do it.
I want to argue for two things here. One, I think the consequentials can adopt that virtue explanation. And two, that it's better for them to cash it out solely in terms of often being something indicative about one's moral character rather than having to do with right or wrong. Okay. So that was abstract. What do I mean by that? Well, if the virtue ethicist and the typical one will say, the rightness or wrongness of acts is determined in part by the motivations of the person acting, then they're going to get cases like that where it's wrong to eat, say, factory farmed meat when you know that it's causally inefficacious if doing so is not what a virtuous agent would do, right? And the consequentialist that says, no, the rightness or wrongness of acts is determined solely by how good or bad the consequences are. And it's a version of consequentialism that doesn't build motivations into how good or bad the consequences are. Then they can say it's permissible to do, but it probably says something bad about your moral character. And I think that's the more plausible explanation. And I think that's the more plausible explanation because I would ask the virtue ethicist to think about cases where there's multiple wrong acts available and how you should weigh them against one another. So presumably it'll also be wrong and may be wrong in the same way and to the same degree if it's causally efficacious. That is, if purchasing the factory farm meat is going to make a difference to how many chickens or whatever are created and come in. And suppose that you, as a third party, can stop one of two wrong acts. You can either stop the person from eating the chicken where they're eating it as causally inefficacious and will make no difference to animal suffering, or you can stop the other person who's going to do it where it will make a difference. And the consequentialists can say, well, you should stop this person from doing the wrong thing because it's wrong. They both have bad moral character, but you should stop the one that's wrong because it's wrong and it's going to result in some sort of bad outcome. And the virtue ethicist doesn't have that explanation at their disposal. They're just going to say they're both wrong. Now they could still say, well, they're equally wrong, but then you should stop the one that's going to cause more suffering because maybe you'd be displaying virtue if you do that. Maybe you'd be displaying some kind of empathy or something for the chickens if you do that than if you don't. But if we keep going down that route where it turns out that everybody has the same sort of moral reason in these situations, then that seems to significantly narrow the disagreement between this consequentialist view and this virtue ethics view. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I actually think it would be a sort of welcome conclusion if it turns out that experts who think about this tend to be not as far apart on the issues as they might initially seem. So I think that if they go that explanation, then it is still substantively different, but maybe not as different as we might have thought at the beginning. And it's not as different as the typical freshman who comes out of an ethics class is going to think virtue ethics is from consequentialism.
Well, Travis, I want to say thank you for an absolutely fabulous conversation. Always wonderful having you on the show. And for those of you listening on Spotify or on YouTube, we'd love to hear from you. What do you think the most plausible ethical theory is? In your everyday life, do you describe people as being utility maximizers, rule breakers, or as loyal friends? Can't wait to hear from you guys.